Welcome to the Sunday Morning Rant, attempt number 3. Uh, so far I've managed to record the intro for this with the microphone switched off, with the receiving unit switched off, so hopefully this time round I've got it recording with everything switched on, and I've got green lights down there, so that hopefully is the right thing to be. It's not working well. Anyway, coffee in hand now. Espresso. Been reintroduced to Espresso. On silly diet at the moment. Can drink lots of coffee. Espresso, very nice coffee. Stuff advertised by George Clooney, if you don't know what it is. But they make very nice coffee. It all comes in these sort of aluminium pods. Very, very nice. Bit expensive, but very nice. Anyway, so the new microphone has been duly tested, and we're going to go for a rant. So this one is entitled, "Why do I open equipment up?" That's a very good question, actually, and it's a question I do get asked quite a lot. Why do you open equipment up? And one answer is straight: I'm nosy. Okay, I like to open stuff up, and I like to understand what is inside it. Where is the transformer? How is the transformer connected? Where is the board? How complex is the board? What's the display like? Now I'll give you 2 examples of this. Number one is when I opened up the Roland A80, I found that I had effectively a 19-inch 3/4 depth unit, and when you open it up you find right at the back of the unit was the transformer with a big long piece of plastic that ran to the power switch at the front. Then in the middle of the board you effectively had a really tiddly board that did all the logic, if you like. And then you had at the front of the board, you had the panel with the lights and the switches, and at the back you had the panel with all the MIDI connectors. And actually most of that box was completely space air. There was nothing else in that box at all apart from those few components. And it's always worthwhile, you sit there thinking you're getting a nice big box, and you realise that actually most of the box is just air. Then on the flip side, you go and open up the MKS-20. Now, those that don't know what an MKS-20 is, it's the rack mount unit of the Roland RD1000 piano. RD1000 piano is about 5.5 feet long, I suppose, full 88 keyboard, and was the sort of the stable of the Roland stage range for many years in the late 80s, early 90s. Many big acts used the RD1000, including Elton John. He did our entire tour promoting it, didn't he, if I remember correctly? But big, 5.5 feet long. In there are 2 big boards. One board is the tones, one board is the effects and that sort of stuff. Okay. If you open up the MKS-20, you find that both those boards have been packaged in, one on top and one underneath. Okay. It is a very compact unit, and there's lots of circuitry in there. Effectively, they didn't change the circuitry for the MKS-20, they just ported the whole thing in. So the only thing you haven't got is a keyboard. So there's no keyboard controller in there, but everything else that was in the RD1000 is pretty much in that MKS-20 box. And it's very compact. So first thing is, I open it up and I can be nosy. The second reason I open up a piece of equipment is because I am trying to assess the state of the electronics in that piece of equipment. So I have my studio, my collection is a combination of old and new. And I say old and new, I mean I was sitting there thinking, well, the Kronos is pretty new, and then I thought, well, actually I've had the Kronos nearly 5 years now. It is a fantastic keyboard. I've got a System 8 which I've had 2 or 3 years now, and I've bought a number of area bits over the boutique stuff, which I said I'd never buy, but I have, because it just made sense for things I was doing. But I also have a lot of legacy. So I have my T1, I have a D50, I have a DX7, I have an M1. I've got lots of legacy kit. And one of the reasons why when I buy a piece of legacy tech I open it up is because I'm trying to assess the state of the circuitry. Now, when you open up one of these things, the first thing I do is, this is my personal preference, is my rule of thumb. If it has a battery in it, once I work out how to reset the factory resets, whether that's a SysX dump or whatever mechanism it is, I will always change the battery. That's my personal preference. I open it up and I will change the battery. So quite often when you see me do a video, I'm opening the thing up for the first time. That's working out where is there a battery in there. Because if there is a battery in there, I will replace it. And the reason why I replace a battery is because the damn things, if you leave them over a period of time, they will leak. Okay, the modern batteries are less prone to it, but the older batteries are absolutely prone to leaking. And if you don't replace those batteries with a modern equivalent, you can end up with nasty goo all over the circuit board, and that does the circuit board absolutely no good whatsoever. So what I tend to do is I will replace the battery at the earliest opportunity I get. That's the first thing. That's one of the primary reasons for opening it up and finding out whether it's got a battery or not, and what type of battery it is. The other thing I quite often will do is I will replace an old battery with a modern equivalent, and quite often the damn things don't fit, so you have to make a bit of adjustment for that. But that's kind of what I do there. And the other thing I do in terms of inside the keyboard itself is there will be I use the dyno and I put a date in there, and that means next time I open the keyboard up I can look at the date, and if I've got the keyboard open to repair it in some way, then I can look at the date of the last time I changed the battery and work out, well, if it's 7 years, then I'll probably change the battery again. Okay, so that's one. The second thing I'm looking at is I'm looking at the state of the power supply. Now, modern equipment comes quite often with a power supply that is external. So you'll get a brick which plugs into the wall, either directly into the wall or a lead and a little box, and out of that will come a low voltage supply. Now, in those instances, there's probably very little electronics inside the piece of equipment itself, which will have issues. And what I'm really looking for is issues that, or things that sort of flag issues, is heat dissipation. If your unit gets very hot, then there's a good indication that the internal electronics are not performing correctly because it's getting hot. Now, I have said that, and I'll give a caveat to that. Some pieces of equipment had very bad power supplies from day dot, and they got hot from day dot. So, my rule of thumb is if it gets hot, there's a problem. But some pieces of equipment were notorious for that style of issue, or that issue. But if you've got power, mains voltage power, 240, 120, 100, going directly into the back of your keyboard, then there will be a power supply board there. And that power supply board has a number of key components. It will have a fuse. Okay, the fuse is there to protect the keyboard. Now, many of these keyboards, even though they're taking mains voltage in, and I have a pet peeve about fuses in equipment, and I have most of my stuff fused at 1 or 2 amps. In the UK, we have fuses in plugs, and most times when I see a piece of equipment, it comes across to me, I open the plug up and there's 13 amp. I've actually had instances where I open the plug up that's been supplied and there's a piece of wire wound around the terminals. But they have 13 amps. Now, a quick bit of maths will tell you that 13 amps at 240 volts, which is the UK voltage, gives you an equivalent of 2004, 6, 8. So that's about 3,000 watts of power, 3,000 plus watts of power on a 13 amp fuse, and it'll be running hot. But it won't probably blow until you've got 14 or 15 amps running through it. So that's how much power can get to the keyboard. If you've got a keyboard, and I'm looking at one at the moment that is rated at 15 watts, okay, it doesn't take a genius to work out that you're able to supply more power into the keyboard than the keyboard actually needs. Okay, so what I tend to do with those sort of things is I make sure that they're fused with a 1 amp fuse, because that's probably the lowest you can get in the UK, a 1 amp fuse. and that 1 amp fuse will only allow it to actually have 240 watts of power, which is more than enough to supply 15 watts to the keyboard. So okay, that's one of my pet peeves. But then there's normally a fuse inside that actually will take that down to milliamps. Okay, so making sure that only milliamps flow. So you've got two protection systems in there. It will have a transformer. Transformer's there, as it says, it transforms mains voltage to usable voltage, and it's transforming it down from whatever the mains input voltage is to voltages like 5 volts, 12 volts, 15 volts, and that could be 5 volts plus or minus, 12 volts plus or minus, 15 volts plus or minus, depending on what the piece of equipment. Typically you have well, I suppose it depends on the way they design the equipment really, but typically it could be 9 volts in there as well, but typically inside of a piece of equipment you will have the electronics running at about 5 volts. Okay, and they use sort of 12 volts, 15 volts, whatever it is, for generating things like sine waves and audio output. So, you know, they get used in different ways within the circuitry. But be aware that that's what the transformer is doing. It will have multi-taps coming off the input side. So that's the transformer. Then you'll have capacitors. Capacitors are there to make sure that the voltage that comes off is smooth, so they take out any kinks in the voltage, in the sine wave, so they hopefully keep the supply nice and clean. And then you'll have things like voltage regulators, and the voltage regulator is there to make sure that the voltage maintains. If it's 5 volts, it maintains 5 volts plus or minus 0.2 of a volt or something like that. So that's kind of what the power supply is doing. And you're looking for things like, are there scorch marks on the board? Because scorch marks on the board indicate it's overheating. So you can then look at the components around those scorch marks. It could be resistors, it could be voltage regulators, and have a look and see, you know, if there's problems there. I mean, put a meter across the resistor, see if it's still giving the right resistance, because if the resistor's been fried, then it just could be short-circuiting, and that could be causing a problem. Look around capacitors, look for any signs of leakages that show up like fluid on the board, so you're looking for that sort of stuff. And also you're looking for, has the voltage regulators, are they correctly terminated? Do they have thermoconductive paste against the termination to make sure they are dissipating heat? A lot of manufacturers would have terminated, if they had a metal chassis, they will be terminating the voltage regulator against the metal chassis, so there's a lot of surface area for heat dissipation, which is probably one of the reasons why the chassis is getting warm. And if they are terminating against the chassis, make sure there is an earth cable going to the chassis, because obviously if something was to fail, you could end up with voltage in the chassis and you could get electrocuted, then you end up with fried musicians. Not a good scenario. It comes back to the whole thing about, you know, musicians stand on stage in the rain and getting electrocuted by the microphone, because, you know, typically you'd have microphones with 48 volts on them, and, you know, as people know, that, you know, electricians or artists form a good ground to earth, touch the microphone, boom, get a bit of a shock. They can get even more of a shock if they're using more power. So that's what I'm looking for around the power board. I'm looking to make sure the power board's in good condition. If it's not, I will start to change components in and out. So I will take capacitors out, and be careful when you take capacitors out on power boards, because quite often they're glued. So the easiest way really is to sort of, well, I suppose the easiest way I've done it in the past is I've cut the glue, and then desoldered the legs and cut the legs, and then pulled the power. But you need to be very careful with that. Voltage regulators, if I see that it's not maintaining a constant 5 volts, 12 volts, 15 volts, whatever it happens to be, then I will probably go and buy a new voltage regulator, put those on there. If resistors look like fried, take them out, put a new resistor in. You know, there are things to do. So that's one of the first things. The second thing about the general electronics is I'll give the entire inside of the unit a good clean. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's been stood in a non-smoking studio or it's been gigged. There will be dust inside the equipment. Dust gets everywhere, and dust is a good conductor. So if if the dust manages to get across two tracks where there's power running down to those tracks, then it can short circuit the track. Okay, so just give it a good clean. Make sure you've got the chassis earthed so you don't build up any static residue. Give it a good clean. That's what I do. If I see that there is residue from something being spilled in there, then I might have to take more drastic action. So it might be the isopropyl alcohol if it's just a small area. If it's really bad, then it could be sort of a dip in a bucket of soapy water. People always say, "Oh, you can't do that." Yes, you can. A bucket of soapy water will cleans all manner of nasties. But what you have to do is you have to make sure the circuit board is completely dry before you reinstall it, and that probably means sticking it in the airing cupboard for 2 weeks, okay, just to make sure it dries out, because it has to dry out naturally. Prefer isopropyl alcohol, I might add, but sometimes it's such a big task that it's easier to do that way. Just as a side, in years gone by, I used to recondition lights, nightclub lights, and these things used to come down. They were coated in nicotine, and to be honest, the only way to get the nicotine off these things was to actually soak them in a bucket of soapy water for about a day, which would then lift the nicotine off the board, which you could then scrub off, and then you could clean the board and put the lights back together. So that's the first thing, give it a good clean. And then what I'm looking for is I will go across the board. There's not a really big scientific exercise here, but I'm looking for signs of things like dry joints. And a dry joint will show up, if it's visual, it will show up like a crack in the solder. So you can just hot soldering iron, dab of solder, bang. You can fix that very, very quickly. It's a very quick fix. To fix a dry joint, just let the stuff reflow. So you can do that. So I'm looking for that sort of thing. I'm looking for capacitors that are leaking. So, if you see what looks like fluid around a capacitor, that's a good indication that capacitor might be on its way out. So looking to change that. Now, you have to be with a power board, it doesn't really matter the type of capacitor you put back in there. Well, I say it doesn't really matter. It does matter, but there's less. If you change the capacitors on the power board, you're changing the power component of a power board. If you change the capacitors on a audio circuit, you can change the characteristics of the audio circuit. So you just need to be very careful that the capacitors you put on an audio circuit are very, very close, if not the same as the capacitors that came off the audio circuit, just newer ones. Okay, so just be very, very mindful of that sort of stuff. So I'm looking for that, and then I'm looking for what's the state of the tracks. Has there been any previous repairs to the equipment? I'll tell you a story. I looked at a keyboard a little while back, and I opened the keyboard up to see that somebody had done some mods to the keyboard itself, and they'd broken a load of tracks in the keyboard itself to make those mods. I think it was a very shoddy job, if I'm brutally honest, and I just walked away from it because it wasn't the sort of thing I wanted to be playing with. Because once you start breaking tracks, and I went through this when I was doing the T1 modification a couple of years back, to put the LCD contrast pot in. Once you start breaking tracks, you don't know what else you're going to break. You don't know what else is being powered by that track. Now, it could be the end of the line of the track, and you don't care. But from my perspective, I'd rather not break the track of the original board. I like to keep the original board intact and do the mod somewhere else. So that either means taking taps off the board and moving to a separate circuit board, or whatever it happens to be. But that's my preferred method of doing a mod. So once you've done that, once you've had a look at that, I'm looking to see, have tracks lifted. So if you've had a previous damage to the board, then it's possible the tracks have started to lift. Once tracks have started to lift off the board, it becomes a nightmare to maintain them. At that point, you're almost to the point of binning it and saying that's it, end of life. It would be good for people to actually start, being out, so you could actually reproduce these boards and then resolder the components onto a new board. I think we're getting into the right space in terms of where technology is and printing and circuitry and that sort of stuff, but I'm not sure it's cost effective at the moment. But it would be good for manufacturers to sort of be able to sort of say, right, you want a brand new T1 board, I'll give you a brand new T1 board and it'll cost you $50 or something like that. But that's the kind of thing I'm looking for inside the equipment. I'm also looking for spillages. Spillages is another classic one, where you see residue on a keyboard, or definitely on the key bed, where the contacts are. Especially if it's been gigged. I mean, I have a rule that in the studio I don't have any fluids in the studio, purely because I don't want to sort of do that and knock stuff into my highly prized electronics. But what I'm looking for is has stuff been knocked in there in the past, telltale signs, sticky, residue. But that sort of stuff will eat the circuit board if left unchecked. So I've done it before myself. I've knocked coke into a keyboard, take it home, strip the keyboard down immediately, take the board out, stick it in a bucket of warm soapy water, give it a good clean, get all the residue, all the stickiness off it very, very quickly, neutralize because anything that's sticky is going to be slightly acidic. Acid will melt the copper tracks. You ruin your board. So in terms of why do I open a keyboard, they're the key reasons, or why do I open a piece of equipment up? They're the key reasons why I do it. I do it because if I'm going to put it into a rack, I don't want to take it out of that rack because it's going to fail to work for a period of time. So do all the maintenance up front, put it into the studio, or put it into storage, wherever it's going to go, and then I don't have to touch it for a period of time. That, I think, is the long-winded reason why I open keyboards up. Until next time, bye-bye.
Remember, hit that like button if you like what you saw. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified about more rants, more mailbag, more questions and answers, and more videos about this sort of stuff when it's loaded to the channel. Until next time, bye-bye.